Putin is bluffing, as shown by the failed Russian summer offensive, according to the Atlantic Council. And the publication noted that there is one foolproof way to bring the Russian dictator to the negotiating table, and Ukrainians are ready for it, but Europe is not. Meanwhile, the Institute for the Study of War reports that the Kremlin is creating an illusion of inevitable victory, despite the record losses of its army, and in fact exaggerates the successes of the occupiers at the front during that very so-called summer offensive. And in fact, military experts call the failure of this summer offensive not just a problem but a catastrophe for the Russian army. But Putin puffs his cheeks and claims we'll break through any moment. Me, Alexei Pechiy. Today is September 3rd. Now, let's take a look together at what experts are saying about the Russian army's summer offensive in Ukraine. But before we begin, I want to remind you that every day on this channel there are fresh news and analytical reports, so that you stay up to date with absolutely all the news and the entire information agenda of the day. So be sure to subscribe to this YouTube channel and hit the like button under this video. Let's go through everything step by step. The Atlantic Council notes that early in the year, rumors suggested Russia's summer offensive would decide the war, and many thought Ukraine was near collapse. As stated in the Atlantic Council article, even the Russian dictator Vladimir Putin at that time claimed that there was reason to believe that they could finish off the Ukrainian forces. That's his quote. It seemed that everything was ready for Russia to finally break Ukraine's stubborn resistance and win the war. However, with the arrival of September, it became absolutely clear that Putin's large-scale summer offensive had failed, the publication notes. The commentators noted that the Russian army failed to break through the front line or capture even a single major Ukrainian city. And Russia's overall advance over the 3 summer months was limited to just 0.3% of Ukraine's territory. It's important to note that key strategic objectives, such as Pokrovsk, have remained under the control of the armed forces of Ukraine. Moreover, the Kremlin's ambitious plans to expand the war into the Sumy and Kharkiv regions have also failed. As the publication writes, in the first weeks of the summer offensive in June, the overconfident dictator Putin confidently declared that all of Ukraine is ours and threatened to capture Sumy. But by the end of summer, his troops found themselves trapped in several border villages as they tried to retreat after a series of military setbacks. The publication emphasized that the failure of Putin's summer offensive should help dispel the persistent myth of inevitable Russian victory in Ukraine. For too long, the international perception of the war in Ukraine has been distorted by exaggerated notions of the Russian Federation's military power. The publication noted that this state of affairs even led to criticism of Ukraine from United States President Donald Trump. He was puzzled that Ukraine dared to defend itself against a much larger aggressor, while at the same time stating that, quote, Russia had somehow destroyed. Uniquely accustomed to waging wars and winning them, that is, Trump was sure that Russia would win any moment now. He was surprised by how Ukrainians resisted such power, which no longer seemed so great. The Atlantic Council notes that Putin's ability to intimidate Western leaders is his greatest achievement in a war where his army has shown results far from expectations. The success of his saber-rattling is a triumph of style over substance, which is convenient to ignore. At the same time, largely relying on the obvious unwillingness of the West to confront the Kremlin, as the evidence of the Russian army's limitations grows, this unwillingness becomes increasingly hard to justify. Of course, as commentators note, it would be extremely foolish to underestimate the threat posed by Putin's military machine. Since the Russian army surpasses all the armies of Europe and is also reinforced by a huge number of drones, missiles and aircraft, as well as a ruthless political will, which is almost completely absent in most European capitals. But at the same time, it is extremely important to recognize that a Russian victory in Ukraine is by no means inevitable. The Atlantic Council notes that the costly failure of Russia's summer offensive is a clear signal that Putin's war against Ukraine is not going according to plan. However, so far the Kremlin dictator shows no signs of compromise and still believes he can achieve victory through bluffing. But his army is obviously much more vulnerable than he would like everyone to believe. As the publication notes, if Ukrainians get needed support from allies. The latest data shows that they are more than capable of turning the tide on the battlefield in their favor and forcing Putin to come to the negotiating table. And in this sense, the Institute for the Study of War in Washington writes that the Kremlin is exaggerating the occupiers' successes on the front line. The Kremlin systematically exaggerates the scale of military achievements to create the illusion of an inevitable victory over Ukraine and to influence the opposition of Western partners. Analysts at the Institute note that the Russian military leadership is systematically spreading false information about the pace of the offensive. For example, Valery Gerasimov, chief of the Russian General Staff, claimed that since March 2025, the Russian army has supposedly captured 3,500 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory and 149 settlements. However, according to verified data, the actual figures are much more modest, about 2,300 square kilometers and 130 settlements. A similar statement was made by the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation, Andriy Belousov, who claims that Russian troops are advancing by 600 to 700 square kilometers every month. In reality, according to experts' estimates, in 2025, this figure does not exceed 450 square kilometers. The Institute for the Study of War notes the Kremlin is ignoring its own catastrophic losses. In 2024 alone, at least 93,000 Russian soldiers were killed, and since the beginning of 2025, more than 56,000. Despite the use of mobile groups on ATVs and motorcycles, the advance of the Russian army remains sluggish and lacks strategic sustainability. Here's a quote from the Institute. Moscow is trying to make the West believe that Ukraine is incapable of winning and to push it toward reducing support, but this is a false and dangerous illusion. I'll leave it at that for now and immediately invite you to write your opinion and your conclusions in the comments below this episode. Let me remind you once again, every day on this channel there are fresh news analysis segments so that you stay up to date with absolutely all the news of the day. That's all for now. Take care. Goodbye, everyone.